Hello again. This is Chapter 4, Week 4, Lecture 4 of American Environmental History. And this time we're going to be talking about the frontier and the grid. We'll explore the lure of the Western frontier on colonists and early Americans and how people began expanding westward after the initial European settlement of North America. So looking at colonial North America, we noticed that many English coastal settlements had been established on sites that were previously used by Native Americans who had disappeared due to disease or due to the social chaos caused by the epidemics and by wars with the whites. As settlements moved westward, Euro-Americans, initially English Americans, but then European Americans, were less likely to be able to take advantage of abandoned settlements and native improvements to the land. As time passed, fields and forests that Indians had cleared and maintained with fire filled in again. And sometimes settlers farther west actually found natives still occupying their ancestral lands and unwilling to share with people that they considered invaders. Many settlers tried to choose uncontested places to make their homes, but they weren't always successful, as the long string of 18th and 19th century Indian wars demonstrates. The continent was large, and the population density of native cultures was often much lower than that of Euro-American settlements. Though there were always pioneers willing to take their chances in Indian country on the frontier, many families preferred to move to regions that were already considered to be well-established territory and safe and open for settlement. Although there were some notable exceptions, most of these regions were reasonably safe from Indians who had already been pushed farther west. So for many settlers, the idea of moving westward involved less Indian fighting and more clearing unoccupied land to make it productive for their style of European-influenced American agriculture. The frontier has always been a powerful magnet for American imagination. It's not well remembered in most of our histories, but one of the grievances for the American Revolution was colonial anger that the British had accommodated the Indian nations that had allied with them against the French in the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, from 1756 to 1763. And the British had accommodated them by limiting westward expansion of the colonies. The Cherokee Nation and the powerful Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy had sided with the British against the French and against other native nations. But like other natives, England's Indian allies were alarmed by the inexorable growth of the colonies and wanted some assurance that their territories would be respected. In 1751, Benjamin Franklin had boasted that for every English baby born in Britain, 2 were born in America. And soon there would be more Englishmen in the New World than there were in the Old. The Iroquois, whose homelands included what's now Western New York and Pennsylvania, saw their political stability and their way of life threatened by expanding English settlement. So as a reward for the Indian support and out of respect for the Confederacy's continuing military strength, the British government issued a proclamation establishing a Western colonial boundary. The proclamation line followed the Appalachian Mountains and is represented by the line between the red area and the pink area on this map. It cut through Western New York and Pennsylvania and created an Indian reserve stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. The English colonists were enraged. Many of their royal charters had given the colonies land grants that extended into the continent and theoretically all the way to the Pacific Ocean. The colonists believed that the Crown's acknowledgement of these Indian claims to that territory was a betrayal of their futures. And for many, the issue was more than just symbolic. Anticipating growth at the end of the 7 Years' War, many Americans had jumped the border and had already gone and settled. And many other Americans had begun investing in the territory beyond their settlements. So following the proclamation, wealthy land speculators like George Washington instructed their agents to begin buying just as much Indian land as they could west of the mountains. Washington warned his partners to, quote unquote, keep this whole matter a profound secret, end quote. A lot of the surveying work that Washington is famous for doing in his youth, he did on the wrong side of the proclamation line. The Sons of Liberty and the Continental Congress, when they met in Philadelphia and drafted the Declaration of Independence, one of their many complaints against King George III was that he had, in their terms, unleashed merciless Indian savages against the colonists. Natives continued to resist when colonists appeared on their lands. Many Indians sided with Britain during the American Revolution, seeing the continued British control of the Americas as their best hope of retaining their land and their sovereignty. Unfortunately for the natives, the colonists won their independence, and barriers to Western expansion were swept away. At the Treaty of Paris in 1783, Britain relinquished its claim to all of the territory east of the Mississippi to the new United States. Although the new nation's economic fate still depended heavily on its being part of an Atlantic trading community dominated by England, the unconquered frontier to the west was a strong influence on American policy and on American culture. When the United States took its first national census in 1790, Americans discovered that half of their population was under the age of 16. At the end of the 18th century, the American birth rate was higher than any birth rate ever recorded in a European nation. For comparison, it was more than double the highest birth rate ever achieved in the post-World War II baby boom. America's growing population needed an outlet. For example, the western Massachusetts hill town of Ashfield, where I've done a lot of primary research, contained 130 families in the early 1800s. Most of the town's residents were farmers. Even the town doctor kept a cow and raised hay to feed his horses. The average family had 5 children. Ashfield's largest families had 11. As the children of Ashfield and other young Americans grew up, they naturally looked westward. In contrast with the colonial Hudson River Valley, which had developed a feudal social structure of large estates and tenant farmers, and in contrast also with the Tidewater South, which had developed an economy dominated by plantations worked by enslaved Africans, New England and the middle colonies and the mid-Atlantic states, as they became, had established a system of small-scale land ownership that continued after independence, creating large numbers of modest, self-sufficient farms. Yeoman farmers, as they were called, owned their land, and they fed their families and their livestock from its produce. If farmers produced surpluses, they would sell them, often to the town miller, who would then aggregate local products, local grain, mill them into flour, and ship them to the cities, to eastern cities. The cash that farmers earned selling their surpluses could be used to buy manufactured goods that were not available in the local economy, and sometimes even to buy luxury items. Some farmers even grew specialty crops specifically for these distant commercial markets. Ashfield happened to specialize in peppermint, for peppermint oil. But their priority, if push came to shove, was always feeding their families. And as those families grew, feeding everybody became harder to do. Most farm families owned about 80 acres, and in a town like Ashfield, a lot of that land was made up of wooded hills and rocky pastures that were difficult to cultivate. While hard-working farm families could feed themselves, only one son could realistically inherit the farm and have enough tillable land left to support a new family. Splitting a farm between all the family's children would leave no one with enough farmland to raise the next generation. The obvious solution was to pass the farm to one son, which meant that the rest of the children had to repeat the work of their parents and start a new farm. And as local land filled up, that meant starting a new farm farther west. The new United States government made it easy for young families to start new farms. The Continental Congress, actually, before the establishment of the U.S. Constitution, the Congress appointed a committee that included Thomas Jefferson to figure out how best to dispose of the land that the new nation had acquired in that 1783 peace treaty with England. Technically, all of this territory belonged to the nation rather than to the 13 new states individually. And since under the Articles of Confederation, Congress was not allowed to levy taxes, land sales were considered an appropriate way to raise funds to run the new government. The result was the Northwest Ordinance, which created the Northwest Territory and specified the way that Western lands could be surveyed and parceled and sold. The Northwest Territory included lands that would become Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and the eastern part of Minnesota. The ordinance decreed that townships would be standardized as 6-mile squares. And the 6-mile squares, they're 6 by 6, they would be divided into 36 lots called sections of 1 square mile each. 1 square mile is 640 acres. 5 of these sections would be reserved for government or public purposes, including lot number 16 in the very center of each township, which would be designated to hold a mandatory public school. With half of the nation's population under the age of 16, free public education was considered a key to American progress. So public schools were built into one of the United States' earliest national laws. Each square mile section contained 640 acres of land. And that could be subdivided into quarter sections of 160 acres each, or even into half-quarter sections of 80 acres, which most people considered in the early 19th century to be the smallest size you could have for a successful farm. In towns and cities, land could be subdivided all the way down to 60 by 125 foot single-family building lots. The price of land on the frontier would remain low for most of the 19th century, beginning at $1 an acre and later rising to $1.25 per acre. Although after the Specie Circular in 1836, payments at the land offices had to be made in cash rather than in banknotes. In the big cities, speculation could quickly drive land prices up, causing property bubbles like the one that inflated Chicago real estate values by 40,000% in the early 1830s, driving land prices in Chicago up to New York City levels before bursting in a storm of foreclosures in 1841. Western New York and the territory just west of the Ohio River were among the first public lands to be surveyed and to be sold. Ashfield families like the Rannies followed the Mohawk Valley and made farms in territory that had previously been beyond the Proclamation Line in western New York, on land taken during the Revolutionary War from the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy. Like many forward-looking families, the Rannies, as soon as they moved to upstate New York, also invested in frontier land in Michigan. Just a few years after the family moved west from Ashfield, several of the younger Ranny brothers moved farther west to Michigan. But the family ties held, and the Rannies remained in close contact with each other throughout their lives. Settlers from Connecticut and New Jersey as well rushed into the Ohio River Valley, which was close to Virginia and western Pennsylvania, just across the Appalachian Mountains and the old Proclamation Line. Ohio Valley land was prized because although it was difficult bringing wagon loads of farm products back across the Appalachians and the Allegheny Mountains to market cities, the Ohio River began at Fort Pitt, which later became Pittsburgh, and flowed down into the Mississippi at what's now the southern tip of Illinois. Enterprising farmers could float their surplus grain down the rivers to the Spanish port of New Orleans, where merchants could put it on ships bound for East Coast cities or the Caribbean or even Europe. Western New York filled up quickly, and settlement of the Ohio Valley was equally rapid. The Ohio Territory became a state in 1803. Many new Ohio farmers were from the middle states, like Connecticut and New Jersey, whose original colonial charters had actually included parts of the Northwest Territory. As they left their settled homelands to cut new farms out of this wild land, these Yankee farmers started a pattern that would repeat itself many times over the next century. When many settler families arrived at the parcel that they had often bought sight unseen from the land office, their new homestead was often just trackless forest. Old-growth woodlands covered most of the area between the Atlantic coast and the Mississippi. So this experience was repeated again and again. Before doing anything else, settlers moving to western Massachusetts in the 1760s, or western New York in the 1810s, or Michigan in the 1830s, would need to build a shelter and clear enough land to raise crops that would get them through their first winter and feed the few animals that they had brought. Settlers often cleared fields by girdling trees, cutting a broad strip of bark to kill the tree, and then letting them die before cutting them down. They would plant corn Indian style in hills between the standing deadwood. The following season, they would cut and burn the dead trees, and after rotting for a few years, the stumps could be removed, and then the field could finally be plowed for wheat. A hardworking settler family could clear about 7 acres of land per year. The ashes from the burned forest provided nutrients for the soil and also potash for sale in eastern cities. Potash was used to make soap, and was often the first product that Western settlers were able to ship back to Eastern merchants to earn a little bit of cash. Pioneer life was very hard work. In addition to clearing land and pasturing animals and raising crops, settlers had to cut and split between 30 and 40 cords of firewood every year for heating and for cooking. Women spent much of their time cooking, which is a slow and tiring process when you have to do it over an open fire in a one-room cabin. In their spare time, pioneer women raised their 5 children, and some of them wove cloth to make their families' clothing. After a couple of decades, a successful settler family usually had 20 to 30 acres of improved land and a substantial woodlot to supply their annual firewood needs. Since the frontier had been surveyed into these 6 square mile townships on a grid, there was usually a village or a town within walking distance, providing a school, a little bit of social life, and a small market for surplus goods. Merchants, as I said, often took produce from farmers and brought them to the city. Right? They took the produce in payment for manufactured goods and supplies that the farmers couldn't make themselves, and then the merchants shipped the farm products to cities for consumption or for export, and bought supplies of city goods on annual buying trips that they would take to the East Coast. In addition, peddlers carrying baskets or trunks of small goods like sewing needles, buttons, and medicines traveled on foot throughout these new states and into the new territories, bringing goods and news and connection with the Eastern culture, even to the remotest farmsteads. By the time the farm was well established, the family was usually quite large. One son, usually the youngest, would inherit the farm in return for taking care of his parents in their old age and at the ends of their lives. Youngest sons tended to inherit the farm in the northeastern states and in the territories that Yankee families settled, because the older sons would have already grown up too soon for their parents to retire. The youngest would stay at home and take care of the aging parents in exchange for inheriting the family property. The older sons, who would usually be adults long before their parents were ready to give up working, inherited cash when there was an estate to divide, and often moved farther west to establish their own farms while their parents were still alive. The Northwest Ordinance, which was passed in 1787, before the U.S. Constitution was even ratified, opened the territory that would become Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota, as I said. In addition to establishing the grid and setting aside land for public schools, one of the most important elements of the ordinance was that it prohibited slavery in these territories. This prohibition had a major impact on both the politics and the environments of the territories and later the states created by the ordinance, because it prevented the spread of large plantations based on slave labor and encouraged the style of small-scale land ownership and family farming that we now associate with Thomas Jefferson's ideal of the independent yeoman farmer. Jefferson, ironically a slave owner who wrote eloquently about freedom and equality, was a living symbol of this new young nation's moral struggle. Many northern farmers moving west came from old Yankee families with long traditions of sympathy for abolitionist causes. Others understood that their small farm produce would have a difficult time competing in a market for farm products that had been produced using unpaid labor from plantation slaves. Many Western farmers joined Free Soil political groups that helped to create the anti-slavery Republican Party, ultimately, that was established in 1854, either in Ripon, Wisconsin, or Jackson, Michigan, depending on which stories you read, and later to elect President Abraham Lincoln in 1860. Thomas Jefferson's 1803 Louisiana Purchase had doubled the size of the United States, and it opened an even wider territory for expansion, extending all the way to what's now the Idaho border in the Northwest. But ironically, it also reopened the conflict over slavery in the territories. When compromises between the free state and slave state delegates resulted in a constitution that had failed to abolish slavery, most Americans believed that the slave problem, quote unquote, would ultimately take care of itself. The importing of new slaves from Africa ceased in 1807, and opponents of slavery believed that slavery would become increasingly irrelevant as the southern slave states were surrounded by new free states on all sides. However, as territories gained statehood, it became clear to Southern politicians that the balance of power was going to shift toward the abolitionists if slavery was prohibited in all the new states. The Missouri Compromise in 1820 attempted to retain this balance of power by admitting states in pairs, one free and one slave. When Kansas and Nebraska territories were both preparing for statehood in the 1850s, the compromise was broken in favor of a scheme described by its proponents as popular sovereignty. Under the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, the populations of the territories would be able to vote on whether to enter statehood as a free or as a slave state. Supporters of slavery immediately began trying to influence the election through bullying and intimidating residents. Abolitionists retaliated by sending over 1,000 Free Soil settlers into the territory to swing the election their way, many armed with Sharps rifles, reportedly supplied by New England preacher Henry Ward Beecher. Two separate territorial legislatures claimed to represent the will of the people, and each claimed that the other was the result of voter fraud. Two constitutions were written, one supporting slavery and the other one opposing slavery. Vigilante groups on both sides terrorized and occasionally murdered their opponents. The conflict, which became known as Bleeding Kansas, was not resolved until the Civil War, when Kansas was finally admitted to the Union as a non-slave state in January 1861. By 1810, after nearly a generation of westward expansion following the Northwest Ordinance, the Ohio and Cumberland River valleys were beginning to look a lot like the settled areas of the original eastern states. Frankfort, Cincinnati, and Nashville were becoming centers of commerce, as was Buffalo, New York, on the shore of Lake Erie. St. Louis on the Mississippi, and Detroit on the western end of Lake Erie were also growing, as people continued looking to the frontier for new opportunities. In the southern states, westward expansion of the plantation system was challenged by the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations. The original policy of the United States government under its first president, George Washington, and then continued by Thomas Jefferson, had favored what they called acculturation of the natives and their assimilation into American society. Impressed by American institutions, a lot of the Indians had adopted many of the elements of Euro-American culture, including things like a two-house legislature, a legal system based on that of the United States, and even slavery in the case of the Cherokee Nation. But Southern planters were not equally impressed by their Indian neighbors, and they lobbied for the government to remove the Indians and make the western lands available for their own expansion. President Andrew Jackson, who was himself a Tennessee plantation owner and a slaveholder, led a campaign for the legislation to remove the Indians from their lands. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 passed in spite of stiff opposition, including opposition from Tennessee Congressman Davy Crockett, who spoke out against the bill. The new law was quickly judged unconstitutional by an 1832 Supreme Court decision, Worcester versus Georgia, that ruled in favor of the natives. But President Jackson just ignored the court's decision, and the natives were removed anyway to a region known as the Indian Territory, which later became Oklahoma, along the infamous Trails of Tears. Along with population pressure, one of the main factors accelerating Western settlement was improving transportation technology. Although they were far from Eastern cities and clearly understood the importance of remaining self-sufficient, many Western settlers still consider themselves part of the Atlantic commercial world. Success beyond mere subsistence for a growing number of farmers depended on their ability to get their produce to Eastern markets. The first phases of expansion had allowed farmers to use waterways, like the Hudson River in New York and the Allegheny and Ohio rivers in the Middle West, to float their surpluses to markets like New York City, St. Louis, or New Orleans. The growth of trade convinced Americans that transportation was going to be the key to expanding the frontier. We'll return to this topic in greater detail in a couple of chapters, but here's an early example. The Erie Canal, begun in 1817 and finally completed in 1825, opened not only western New York, but the entire Great Lakes region to commercial shipping. Less than 10 years after the canal opened, the last fulling mills that processed homespun cloth for frontier farm women disappeared from the Mohawk Valley as western New York farmwives jumped at the opportunity to reduce their workloads by buying Eastern textiles. By 1830, after nearly another generation of growth, the sons of farmers who had moved to the Ohio Valley and to western New York were on the move again. This time, their destinations were Illinois, Indiana, and southern Michigan. Cincinnati and Louisville were now major cities, and settlement was extending up the Missouri River as well as up the Mississippi. Federal land offices sold most of the land between the original 13 states and the Mississippi River, during the first half of the 19th century. Beginning with the Northwest Territory, the land was surveyed and the grid for townships was laid out. This pattern of well-organized settlement can still be seen in satellite images or even from the windows of airplanes flying over the Midwest. The average size of the working farm today is much closer to that full mile square section than to the quarter or half-quarter section that the original settlers had mostly bought at the land office. But the grid pattern can still be seen from above. Farm technology like John Deere's 1838 steel plow and Cyrus McCormick's reaper, which he patented in 1837, helped Western farms produce wheat for commercial markets. Bad harvests in Great Britain and then wars in Europe provided high profits to exporters throughout much of the 19th century. More Eastern farmers moved west, often selling their old farms near growing cities at profits that allowed them to buy substantially more land at cheaper Western frontier prices. The land office's typical price, as I said, during the first half of the 19th century remained $1.25 per acre. Historians and novelists and later screenwriters have often claimed that pioneers moving west were forced to sever all their ties with homes and families and to strike out on their own. Some have even suggested that migration to the frontier wiped away all of the trappings of old world culture and produced a new and a distinctly American civilization. Many argue that the stresses of frontier life may have helped produce the individualism and the focus on nuclear families that are considered such a distinctive part of the American character. The image of the independent American, especially of the cowboy, has become an important part of our national self-image. The concept of manifest destiny, the idea that America had a special mission to spread the virtues of democracy across the continent, was the public expression of the idea that the American character was unique and superior. This image from the 19th century called American Progress shows Columbia, the spirit of America, sort of flying westward from East Coast cities, followed by stagecoaches and behind that by trains. And as you might be able to see, she has a spool of telegraph wire around her arm, and she's sort of dragging the telegraph behind her. So progress is making its way west. And it's quite true that it took courage and it took self-reliance to settle the Midwest or to travel all the way to the West Coast, which before the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, pictured in this painting in 1869, required a grueling month-long trip on foot or horseback across the continent, or a dangerous ocean voyage around the Straits of Magellan at the bottom of South America. But remarkably, families managed to stay connected in spite of these differences. For example, the Ranney family that I mentioned from Ashfield, they were a Scotch-Irish family who had arrived in colonial Connecticut in the 17th century. Several brothers moved to Ashfield, Massachusetts around 1790, and then their sons moved to Phelps in western New York in the 1830s. A few years later, several of the Ranney brothers and cousins moved on to Michigan. A couple of Ranneys even went further and had adventures in the Indian Territory, Kansas, and in the California Gold Rush. But throughout the 19th century, the brothers kept in touch through frequent letter writing, visiting each other, and they even did regular business with each other and sent money in both directions. The Michigan Ranneys sold farm produce to their merchant brother Henry back in Massachusetts, and family members regularly loaned money to each other across the miles. The important point is, many American pioneers continue to consider themselves part of extended families and diligently held on to family connections in spite of the great distance and the limited communications. In addition to families extending themselves westward, Immigrants from Britain and Europe continued to come to America and joined the flow of farmers and farmers' sons to the frontier. America's poor diplomatic relations with England between the time of the Revolution and the War of 1812 hampered immigration until after the end of the War of 1812. But the end of hostilities opened the floodgates. Continuing wars in Europe and social upheavals of the early Industrial Revolution strengthened the flow of immigration that continued throughout the 19th century. In the 1840s, nearly half of the immigrants from Europe to the United States were Irish, fleeing the agricultural disaster known as the Irish potato famine. Unlike the Andean Indians, who had developed hundreds of varieties of potatoes for a wide range of purposes, Europeans grew only a few varieties, bred from a small batch of imported seed potatoes. 350 years after the first potatoes had been brought to Europe by Columbus, most of the 2 million acres of potatoes grown in Ireland were a single variety called the Irish lumper. Potatoes were so inexpensive to grow, so reliable and so high yielding that the population of Ireland had exploded in the early 19th century. From a starting point of about 1.5 million in 1600, Ireland's population grew by 600% in 200 years, reaching about 9 million people in the early 1800s. Of those 9 million people, 4 out of 10, or over 3.5 million Irish people, ate no solid food except potatoes. Monoculture created vulnerability, and because both Ireland's economy and a large part of the nation's food supply depended on just a single crop, when the first reports of the potato blight came out in September 1845, the English landlords who owned most of Ireland's farmland were slow to react. In the next 2 months, the blight wiped out about 750,000 acres of potatoes. The following year was worse, and the landowners had made no efforts to plant other crops, or even to find blight-resistant varieties of potatoes. The year after that was even worse. Over 1 million people died in Ireland, and about 1.5 million fled the country. By 1850, Irish immigrants accounted for more than half the populations of Boston, New York, Baltimore, and Philadelphia. After 1850, immigration from Germany accelerated as Germans fled the chaos caused by their unsuccessful revolutions of 1848 and 1849. Over 42 million Americans of German descent were counted in the 2000 census, making German Americans the largest ethnic group in America. While some of these German and later Irish immigrants farmed, many became tradesmen, factory workers, and laborers in northeastern cities, and then in the newer cities on the northwestern frontier: Pittsburgh, Toledo, Milwaukee, Chicago, and even Bismarck, North Dakota, which is named after the Chancellor of Germany, Otto von Bismarck, were all noted in the 1900 census as having populations of between 50 and 75% what they called whites of foreign parentage. The black population, of course, was still largely trapped by slavery and then by its aftermath in the South. The slave economy is also cited as a major cause of low immigration to the southern states in the 19th century. Immigrant farmers or wage workers from Europe had no place in a society where most wealth was held by aristocratic families and most of the work was done by plantation slaves and then later by dirt poor sharecroppers. For a long time, historians believed that at about the same time that the Civil War destroyed the plantation system in the South, transportation and Western farms had killed agriculture in the old Northeast in New England. Western farms were larger, they said, and the land was more fertile and easier to work than the hilly, rocky, exhausted soils of New England and the northeastern states. This belief actually influenced the country life policies of progressives in the early 20th centuries, and has lived on in current farm and environmental policies, as we'll see later on. But if we look more closely at the details, a different picture actually emerges. A closer look at the data on land ownership and farm produce shows that New England farmlands continued increasing and forests continued shrinking until the final years of the 19th century. And by that time, New England was over 90% deforested. This was long after the Midwest had taken over as the breadbasket of America. The Midwest vastly outproduced the Northeast in staple crops like wheat and corn. Hillside Yankee farms, where it had always been difficult to grow wheat, no longer had to try. They became pastures for merino sheep, a premium sheep breed that became highly sought after it was introduced from Spain. Growing cities certainly lured some people off of eastern farms to work in factories, like the textile mills of the Merrimack Valley that we'll cover in the next chapter. But urban growth also provided a very lucrative market for farm products. And although eastern farmers with their small, steep hillside fields could no longer keep pace with the Midwestern farmer in corn or in wheat production, they could easily outcompete him on milk and on hay. The bulkier and the more perishable a product is, the greater the advantage for the local farmer. Eastern farmers became dairymen, and they grew hay to feed urban horses. And remember, before the age of cars and trucks, there were a lot of urban horses. Eastern truck farms grew fruits and perishable vegetables for nearby city people who no longer grew their own food. And as cities grew, the number of factory and office workers who earned wages rather than producing their own food grew substantially. In the first US Census after the Civil War, less than half of the people counted were listed as working in agriculture for the first time. This division of labor between people who grew their own food and people who didn't accelerated and ultimately created a new profession and a special class of people, American farmers, who were responsible for feeding the rest of us. This major shift in American culture also had major implications for the environment, as we'll discover when we look at it more closely. It's easy to look back from the present when only a tiny proportion of Americans can claim to be self-sufficient and romanticize the yeoman farmer or the pioneer. Many historians share this romantic perspective, and some even insist that 19th century farmers fled westward in order to avoid the degrading capitalism of the cities. However, except for a small number of 19th century Americans who joined religious settlements or utopian communes, most of the settlers who moved west remained interested in the culture and in the commerce of the eastern cities. Like the Mohawk Valley farmwives who had abandoned home weaving as soon as the Erie Canal brought affordable eastern textiles to their doorsteps. Most Americans who moved west tried to maintain a healthy balance between commerce and self-sufficiency. The terms of the negotiation have changed over time, but the challenge to find that balance is one that we still face today. And we'll talk about all of these things more and in more detail as we move forward. But that's all I have for you today. So thanks for listening. I hope this helped, and I'll see you again next time.